You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Travis D. Hahler. He has a book called Rethink Resistance, Embracing Neuroscience to Lead Transformational Change. So we're going to talk about his book and his work and all that. So he's the Senior Director of Global Strategy and Transformation at Salesforce and founder of the Neurological Nomad. So welcome, Travis. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, Richard. Great to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what inspired you to write your book.
Certainly. So my background is in psychology, business, and neuroscience. So really, it's an interesting combination. I started my journey with it really with the psychology, and then went into neuroscience a bit, and then came back and said, you know what, I'm not sure what I want to do with that yet. So I'm going to go into a business field. And I got my MBA. And as I was working in the business world, and I think anyone who's younger feels this, that, everything's so discrete. But once you start actually entering the world, you realize how connected everything really is. And so I started to see the overlaps of, the psychology and the neuroscience in the business space and how they all kind of complemented each other. And so several years ago, around the time when I went to work at Google and I was leading their change and culture work, really I started to play around with this idea that understanding neuroscience had helped me deliver better change and lead better change and transformation throughout my career. And, I really spent the better part of kind of 2 decades now thinking about that and leading change and transformation. And I started to see that, my hypothesis was right. And so after speaking on it and talking to a lot of leaders a couple of years ago, I decided, I think it's ready to be a book. And I'm really excited to have the book coming out and really help leaders anchor in neuroscience to become better leaders of transformation and really think about what happens in humans when we go through change.
What does that mean? Transformation where and how? Is it, when you're coaching people or when you're their boss? Or what's the context?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that you can lead from anywhere. And for, the book in particular, this is really about folks who are leading some form of a change, whether it's that it was their idea or maybe it was someone else's idea and they're having to execute on that idea, which I think in today's world, that's most leaders are sitting in that middle. And then it's also for folks that are kind of on the ground trying to lead change within themselves and maybe being asked to change and understanding really what that means. So the space that I work in most, Richard, really is this organizational transformation and large scale corporate transformation. And so a lot of my experience is helping our senior executives at very large companies understand the human element of making large scale changes, whether that's launching a new product to your customers, or that's internal, making changes to policies or processes or even organizational structures. And then, that translates into our communities too, when we're making changes to, our communities, the way that we live and the spaces that we occupy. So it's really a broad reaching thought, honestly, is this neuroscience of change and how to lead it properly.
Well, do you have a concrete example? What would be a challenge where someone needs to lead something and how can they do it in a way that would work better according to your method?
Yeah. So oftentimes where people are, kind of struck with leading change is where, in the business world, whether that's corporate or, government, public, whatever that might be, oftentimes we're shifting the work that we're doing. So maybe it's a strategy that the organization is shifting to. So as an example, in the AI revolution that we're going through right now, which is probably the most top of mind for most people, we're really shifting in how we do work. what do we depend on, AI to do to actually increase our productivity? What do we almost offshore to AI or outsource to AI? And then how does that help us do our jobs better? This is a huge shift in mindset for people. And so the way that I think traditionally a lot of leaders have faced large scale changes like this one is that they set the vision and they kind of expect that people just trust that their vision is the right vision, and that they're going to get behind them because they're the leader. Oftentimes, and most of the time, that's not the response leaders get. And leaders oftentimes will get the response of hesitation, and it gets coined as resistance most often. What that really is, though, is not necessarily a reflection on their vision or their leadership. And a lot of our leaders take it extremely personally when their teams aren't, jumping up and down and giving that standing ovation. And they think, is it because of me? Is it my vision? Is it my leadership? What is it? It has nothing to do with that. Everything that it has to do with is natural resistance that happens inside our brains as humans. So when we're challenged with something like adopting AI and changing the way that we work and outsourcing to different tools, our brain really goes through this process of natural resistance, which is, I'm really, really good at what I do today. There's a threat process here of, I don't know what I don't know. And there's an unknown element. And so the people that are taking in this change are resisting naturally because that's what our brain is there to do. And so as a leader, as you see your team kind of pulling back, leaning into and partnering really with your brain through things like, ensuring that you're communicating effectively and helping people understand both what you know and what you don't know, the knowns and the unknowns, and kind of going on that journey together, providing that time for people to really build new habits and kind of unlearn old habits. Those are some of the ways that our brain moves through change and moves through that resistance and beyond that resistance to grow and really transform the way that we work.
So, okay, what are some exercises or things that, you have people do to help them accomplish the change that they want? I mean, it's got to be structured somehow. They're not just going to figure it out, right?
Absolutely. So there's 6 barriers that through my research as well as my work that I've identified within our brains. And what I tell leaders is the goal is to kind of become a resistance fortune teller. And that's one of the terms and the nicknames, I guess, that's been coined for me throughout the years. But what it really means is helping to get to the very root cause of where someone is in their journey. And so looking at those 6 barriers, the first is around repetition and our habits. The second is really around, the energy it takes for someone to make a change. The third is around how people feel exclusion in change. The fourth is really that threat response. The fifth is, the inability to really know what you don't know, or that world that is unknown. And then the sixth is loss. And so I kind of talk to leaders about it in almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of way. It's really, you kind of have to move through these steps and figure out which one we're stuck on to move to the others. So your foundational is really about habits. And so for leaders, I have them ask kind of these questions of their people, like, have you started to use the new way of working? Have you started the process? If the answer is no, this is probably a habit foundational element that hasn't been actually moved. You haven't built a new habit. So that's where you start. And that's where as a leader, you can start to provide that time or provide that guidance for your people. If you're moving through and saying, okay, they're already doing it, they're using it. But really what this comes down to is, do you feel like your experience has been kind of captured in the way that we're talking about the change? And if they don't feel like they connect with the change, or they don't feel like they're being seen by that change, really where you're getting stuck then is in this idea that the change is in some way excluding them, and that they're struggling with that exclusion and seeing themselves in the change. And so as a leader, your role is to really bring them into the change, help them see where it is that they fit in that change and what it means for them. And perhaps it's something that's a little different than the other teams teams that have been, spoken to or communicated to about the change.
How do you get people involved with change so they don't feel outside of it, so they don't feel like it's out of their control and it's being forced upon them? But maybe you can't have them 100% on board because they're busy or for whatever reason. You can include them just a little. But what's the minimum you can do to make sure that someone's, again, invested and they feel included and heard?
So as a leader, one of the things that I tell our leaders as we're moving through change is really that there's both including someone in the change, and that can mean really deeply they're included in maybe the ideation or the planning or the execution of that change. But that's oftentimes not where people are in change, especially when they're receiving it. Most people in their journey are somewhere kind of in this limbo of they've heard about it and they're not really sure where they are. And that's kind of where that exclusion sits in. So as a leader, for someone who's not going to be included in the ideation and the planning and the execution of that change, it's oftentimes helpful to share with that person that, you're going through this change too. So you almost create that feeling of connectedness and that feeling of inclusion by creating a group of people, including yourself as the leader, that weren't actually in that ideation or that planning or that execution, but you're going through it together as a cohort, as a group, and you're going through and asking the questions and learning about it together. And that creates some of that connectedness to that change.
So does the book encourage individual people within an organization to propose that to their bosses, or is it more for like a top-down approach? If you manage people, this is how you can manage them better so that they're happier. Who is the audience of the book?
Yeah, the book is primarily for our leaders and leaders of change. So it's not targeted towards the folks receiving change. The idea is that if from our executive leaders all the way down to our frontline managers are able to, grasp this idea of creating an environment that is kind of neuroscience led and brain friendly when it comes to change, that the change will be ultimately better in the end, and the adoption of that change will be better in the end. So it's targeted towards those leaders and managers who have probably direct reports, or at least they're influencing groups of people to make the change.
Any types of changes that, really going to be treated with kid gloves, or they need to be handled in a certain way unless they're like blow up or what?
The hardest part about change is that every change, it includes some form of loss, but there are losses that are much larger than others. And so in the book, we talk a lot about the three types of loss, and there's loss of competence, there's a loss of understanding, so kind of figuring out where you are in the world, and then there's a loss of relationship. So the hardest one oftentimes for people is the loss of relationships. And so when I talk to leaders, especially when companies are going through organizational shifts and structure shifts, those are really, really delicate changes with their people. And so, taking that into account as they're thinking about how they support their people through that loss, and really thinking about it as loss. I think the one thing I've learned over the years of leading, change, is that a lot of leaders don't see change as loss. They oftentimes only look at it from the glass half full, meaning, here are all the great things that this means. They're not always focused on the loss aspect. And it's really the opposite for our people. Our people are far more focused on the loss than they are the gain in most cases. So as a leader, really acknowledging that the loss even exists is a huge, huge win in terms of leading really transformational change. So in those moments where, we have relationship loss, understanding the ways that people are kind of grieving that loss is really important.
Any industries that, with AI coming in, who knows what's going to be the implications of, you got to have conversations around that, as many as you can, I guess. So I don't know, what's your advice?
Yeah. So AI, I think it's one of the really big, obviously, changes that we're dealing with right now. But what makes it even bigger is the fact that you're truly asking people to change the way that they work and think. And the people who are looking at this and saying, okay, you want me to change the way I work and think, you want me to utilize AI to do some of this. At the same time, they're looking at it and saying, I understand that we want to change the process. I understand that we want to change the way that we work. But at what point have I changed the work so much that I almost change myself out of a job and I create an AI model that can do what I do. And so there's a really big tension there. And I don't think we're talking about that enough, Richard, to be honest. The fact that, we keep pushing utilize AI, but what we aren't really acknowledging is that we're creating a world for our workers that is really, really uncomfortable and unknown.
So, yeah, I don't know. Just what typically happens? Just there's no conversation. The change comes. The person either adapts or not, and there's either problems or not, and everyone moves on without a second thought.
That's normally how I think a lot of people move through changes. They think we're going to announce it, we're going to launch it, and then everyone's just going to do it. I talk about this in the book a little bit around the kind of 3 categories of leaders that I talk to, and when I ask, what's going to make the change hard? And oftentimes they respond in kind of one of 3 ways. One is the authoritarian, which is, well, it doesn't really matter because we're going to say it and they're going to do it, or they can leave. The second is the kind of, I call that one the my way or the highway. The second one is really around, the optimist, which is, well, the new solution's so great, right? The new way of working is so great. Why wouldn't they want to do it? And I don't know, like, why would it be hard? And then the third one is really around, they talk a lot about how when people are kind of posed with change, that they're just lazy. People are just inherently lazy. And so they just don't want to do it because they don't want to do it. So that's going to be the hardest part, is overcoming that comfort level that people have with everything. And so those are kind of the 3 categories that pop up most often when you talk to leaders about change, and you really get to the question of what's going to make this change hard. And what that signals to me in many cases is that the leaders are thinking in a way that's not necessarily around what the impact is to the person. They're thinking about the outcome. And so in the authoritarian example, which is oftentimes the way people kind of move through it, is we're going to tell them what it is, we're going to launch it, and then people are going to do it. And what it misses is all of those moments of bringing people along that journey. And that's really the basis and foundation of that neuroscience that we're kind of skipping over. We're not thinking about the fact that people need to have time to change the way that they work. We're not thinking about the fact that they need to understand that why, and they need to understand what it means for them. We're not thinking about the fact that they're giving something up to move forward. So all of that, it's really skipped in most cases. What tells you that if a change that's been instituted by you or someone else it's going wrong, you're having problems? Like, what would that look like? Well, I've done a lot of change. And I've seen a lot of changes go wrong. I've seen a lot of changes right. The people that you're telling what to do, like, we're going to do this now, and they start doing it, but now problems happen. Like, what does that look like? Like, do they quit? Do they slow walk stuff? Do they lay it flat? Do they make a lot of mistakes? Like, what happens when you're like, oh man, it's not working right, I got to fix this? Yeah, there's a lot of ways that change can go really wrong. I think the most common way, and this is probably one of the most dangerous ones for leaders, is the kind of unhappy compliance, which is that, a person will say, okay, I got it. You want me to do this? Fine, I'll do it. But they're not really bought in. They're not really trying to make the change. They're just doing enough to be performative and show like, okay, yep, I'm there. But what happens is when things get difficult or pressure gets put on, stress gets high, those people will revert back to what they know and what's easy for them. So they'll skip around it. And so you'll start to see really interesting things pop up. Things like all of a sudden we're managing in 2 systems, or you've got a system that you've implemented and they're still using a kind of background spreadsheet to keep track of things. Or you'll see them kind of go quiet almost. And when you're talking about whether it's the change or the work, they kind of shrink into the background. And oftentimes the folks that this affects the most are not typically people that, sit in the background and don't speak up. So those are some of the signals that when I'm looking at change, I start to say, you know what, do we have something here where people are saying yes, but they're not really doing it. They're doing it because we want them to, and they recognize that that's really going to help them be successful in making sure that we feel good. But they're in their back of their minds, they're saying, I can kind of work around this. Well, have you ever heard of like laying
staying flat. Like supposedly in China, to resist the regime because the consequences are so bad. Workers just like at times will do as little as possible and just like barely work. And that's the only way they can resist is like by slow walking everything to death, because to do anything else would be like really horrible consequences. So I guess that would be an example of something going horribly wrong with change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the term that I think we've coined in the corporate world is kind of the quiet quitting, right? And you do see that. You see where people are not necessarily ready to change, and they're not really ready to leave either, but they're certainly not going to do a lot of work towards, advancing, because they're really looking for an alternative or a way out. And yeah, that happens a lot, Richard. And I think, what that signals to me, and when we talk to leaders about, change and about how to think about the people that are being impacted and your teams that are being impacted, it really comes down to, again, like we talked about a little earlier, or it's really about making sure that they feel seen in this chain. Yeah. Oftentimes it's just because they don't feel that psychological safety, or they don't feel like they're being seen or supported.
Maybe that's why people in government jobs seem to be all miserable wretches, because they have like no way to affect any of it. It's like this behemoth. They're just a cog in the machine. They got to follow the system, whether it makes sense or not. And that's it. Too bad, buddy.
You might be onto something.
Yeah. So, any positive, well, I'm sure there is, but any interesting stories of people that have read the book and implemented your suggestions and, how it helped them?
Yeah. So the book isn't out yet. But a lot of what I've done so far has been in speaking and working with companies directly. And one of my kind of favorite use cases was really early on in the process of kind of developing this idea and this framework. And I was working with an organization that did recruiting. Actually, they were an outsourced recruiting body, and so companies would come to them and say, you know what, we don't want to hire 15 recruiters, but we've got a lot of roles to fill, so we're going to let you take care of it, and let us know who you find. And one of the things that they were trying to do was really create more efficient and effective process. And so they were doing a ton of changing of, the process itself, the policies around it. They were scaling quickly. So they were trying to maintain some form of stability in terms of the culture as well, and here's what we do and here's what we don't do as an organization. And what was happening was that as they were going down this journey, they were seeing that people were really resistant towards these changes, and they weren't adopting them. They weren't adhering to policies. They were kind of maintaining the status quo or reverting back. And so they had started really implementing a rigorous, almost like performance management style assessment for each person. So you got like 3 strikes, and, if you weren't doing this, you got written up, and there's a lot of penalty in the work. And so when I was talking to one of their leaders after we had met through a talk that I did, he kind of brought this problem to me, and I was like, well, let's explore it further. And so as we explored, what we found was that they were implementing so many changes without really providing time for people to actually try it. So they were saying, okay, here's a new process. But as they were getting this new process, they were still expected to maintain their quotas in terms of how many calls they were making, how many people they were connecting with, how many were moving forward. And so because they weren't backing off of any of the normal day-to-day work, those folks weren't able to actually put in any time to try the new process or try the new way of working. And so that was kind of the foundational element for their workers around this is why they're not adopting. So we actually went through and we looked at their process and we looked at the way that they were rolling it out, and we kind of rolled it back. And really what that meant was I said, you know what, we're not going to say, no, these aren't the processes, but what we're going to do is we're going to focus on specific ones. So go back and find the most impactful changes that we can really focus on getting people to adopt. And so we did this process of, all right, here are the most important changes. Let's start with the first one and let's get people adopting and using it and providing them the time. So we're shifting some of the work. So if it was an 8-hour shift, maybe an hour of that was spent just learning or doing the process in a different way and kind of reallocating the way that they were going throughout their day to day. And then we talked a lot about communication and how they were communicating the change, because what they were doing was really just sending out memos of this is the process now. This is the policy now. And so we changed that to be, let's talk about a vision. First, let's set a vision. And then let's talk about how each of these changes gets us closer to that vision or gets us closer to that objective. And so they started talking about it at a high level with their leaders. And then in their kind of pods, their direct, frontline manager pods, the frontline managers were talking about it as well and anchoring it back to that leadership vision for the organization. What we found was that people were really buying in a lot more. And because we were providing them with the opportunity to engage with the change in a moment when they didn't have to be performing, they were far more likely to leave that moment and say, you know what, I am going to do that. I am going to change the way that I'm doing that. And they had those moments where they felt connected, and also they had the time to really play with it and experiment with it, so that when the moment came that they had to perform, they were like, I don't need to spend time playing or experimenting. I know how it works. I can actually do it.
What people that are more naturally self-motivated and are leaders versus people that just say, tell me what to do. How do you handle those two types when you're affecting change? Let's say you're the boss and you got to roll out some stuff, and again, some people just, I've heard from a lot of people, I don't want to be a manager. I don't want that responsibility, But then again, they also don't want to just be forced to do things they don't want to do, or be trapped in a system that they hate. So how do you handle those two personality types?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot of different personality types when it comes to change. But the two that you pointed out are the ones that are going to wait till kind of the last minute to change. They're kind of the holdouts. They're not necessarily what gets coined as resistors necessarily. They're more of the, I'm not sure I want to even engage it yet. And then you've got your folks who are like your early adopters who are like, I'm raring and ready to go. Like, give me the change, I'll do it. So the way that we engage them differently is that your folks that are really raring and ready to go, they're your change champions. They're the ones that you're going to say, hey, you know what? Can you help us? Can you help us get the word out? Can you help share some success stories and how it's worked for you? Can you show that it's safe to do it? And so you really utilize those folks as the proof as to what the change means. And then you have them engage with those folks that are maybe less engaging with the change. So again, not necessarily resisting, but they're also not doing it either. And having them kind of engage them and say, you know what, I've done it. This is how it's helped me. I would love to help you if you would like to, if you need some support, I'm happy to support you. But they become your change champions. And then your folks that are on the flip side, the way that you kind of initially start to engage your individuals that maybe aren't your early adopters is you engage them through understanding what's stopping them. So oftentimes what'll come up are things like, I don't have the time, really busy. That's very common. Or you hear their concerns that are really rooted in their care for the success of the company. That happens a lot too, where folks will say, I don't know that this change is really the right thing to do. And here's why I think that, the way we've been doing it is the right way. And so what that does is it helps you understand really where the mindset of those folks are. And you can kind of meet them at that point and say, it's a great point. Here's how, we're not losing sight of that. Here's how this change actually doesn't impact the thing that you're concerned about. Or here's how the change actually makes that better. And so you can kind of meet them where they are and you can understand their perspective. And in that understanding, you can engage them to start making their way on the journey. And then you can bring in those change champions to really help partner with them and show them in the proof that the change is actually delivering what we're saying it's going to deliver.
Yeah. Okay. Well, very good. For people that want help with this, is your book the first stop, or how can they engage with you for a start?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, the book is a great place to start. It really lays out the framework. It lays out the ideas of, how to lead effective transformation and keep neuroscience at the center and really that human element at the center. And, so that's a great place to start, but you can find me online. I love to engage with, in conversation around, just different challenges that people are facing in transformation. So I'm on LinkedIn, also my website, and both of which are great ways to connect with me. And I'd be happy to.
Well, that's great. Well, Travis, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and explaining all this. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Richard. It was really fun.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.